International Affairs analyst Dr. Bola Adeniran joins us via Skype from London for discussion on the growing opposition to Israel being granted observer status in the African Union. Good to have you join us, Dr. Adeniran.
Thank you for having me.
So, Israel enjoyed observer status in the predecessor organization, that's the Organization for African Unity, which was dissolved in 2002, and ever since it has been trying to enter. Why is this so important for Israel? What does it stand to gain?
Well, for Israel, this is, as you mentioned in your news report, this is a significant diplomatic victory. As you've rightly mentioned, since OAU was dissolved in 2002, Israel has been trying all its, putting all diplomatic stops at being granted observer status with the AU. But I think what is most important about it is that first we have to realize that Palestine, the Palestinian Liberation Authority, was granted an observer status in 2013, which has allowed Mahmoud Abbas to address the African Union, to sort of direct African Union's position on the Palestinian conflict and on the Middle East in a very pro-Palestinian way. And so that is very important for Israel, that its voice is represented on the continent, and it also has the ability and capacity to shape African Union's agenda. The other part of it is that Africa as a continent, as a regional body, is one of the strongest bodies or strongest coalitions in the United Nations General Assembly. And historically, the United Nations General Assembly has been that forum where pro-Palestinian resolutions have been put out, resolutions critical of Israel. Whilst the United Nations Security Council has not been able to do that because of the influence of the US with the veto power, the General Assembly has always had the opportunity to condemn Israel. So if Israel has a foothold on the continent, it can in a way leverage that position to sort of dilute the conversations in the General Assembly. So this is an important progress for Israel in terms of its diplomatic efforts on the continent.
And that's for Israel. But right now, as it stands, Israel's political influence in Africa is very weak. So why would the African Union Commission go ahead to give Israel observer status? And as we now hear and understand, without any real consultation with the leaders of the African Union?
Well, the AU Commission has the capacity to do that. It is within its capacity, within its organizational instruments to be able to admit observers to states. Let us be very clear about this. There are more than 40 states and non-state NGOs who are not from the African continent who have been granted observer status. As I said, Palestinian Liberation Authority, the PLO, has an observer status with the African Union. Serbia, Ukraine, Haiti, there are so many, Turkey. There's so many countries with observer status on the African Union. So this is not surprising, and this is not unusual. What is different with this is that the African Union has always, and its predecessor organization has always had principles that commit the organization towards decolonization efforts, fighting against injustice, racial injustice particularly. And of course, you know that the African continent has a long history of fighting against injustice, partly because of our own experience. So there is this very particular sense of raw emotions that come with Israel being granted observer status just because of our own history. But my position on this is that, African Union should ask itself very important questions. Does it want to look forward or does it want to look backwards? There are many Arab countries that have normalized relationship with Israel since 2018, 2019. The Abraham Accords.
But we haven't seen that in Africa. Sorry to quickly interrupt you because I have very little time left. We haven't seen that in Africa since 1973. That's after the Cold War, or 1978, or I can't seem to put the exact date. But we know that Africans a lot of African countries cut ties with Israel as a result of the role they played during the Cold War. A lot of them haven't been able to reestablish that relations. What should it take for Israel to be an observer in the African Union?
Well, the question, let me quickly respond to what you said earlier. There are a lot of African countries that have actually normalized relationship with Israel. 46 African countries now have relationship with Israel. 9 countries are still holding out. Morocco and Sudan did under the Abraham Accords in 2020. So there is a growing interest in normalizing relationship with Israel. In terms of what it takes, the AU Commission, as I mentioned, under the leadership of Musa Faki, has the capacity to grant observer status to any organization, any state that it deems beneficial to the AU's work and to the AU's interest. And I think that's what the AU chairperson has done. AU Commission chairperson has done, and I feel that it's in Africa's interest to look forward rather than look backwards, especially when Arab countries have done the same.
Well, if AU reverse the decision, it is an embarrassment for Israel. If they don't, it could cause tension in the African Union. So we'll see how all of this plays out. Global Affairs analyst Dr. Bola Adeniran, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you very much.